Okay, thank you everybody, thank you so much for coming along, to all of our speakers. We've had some really fascinating panels and it's been a pleasure to organise, and there's been so much food for thought for me, even just looking at the abstracts, the questions that I can lift and borrow for my own work and my own research. And I don't know about intellectual property or anything like that, but I mean, that's the whole point of these days, to learn from each other. I'm very, very pleased to introduce Dr. Hannah Newton, who is a social historian of early modern England, specialising in illness and medicine, childhood and family, and emotions and spirituality. She is a lecturer in early modern history at Reading, has been since September, but continues in her role as Director of Studies for St John's College, Cambridge. She is the author of... Oh, hello.
Somebody need to jump.
Slight technical difficulty. She is the author of The Sick Child in Early Modern England, which is this wonderful book which I can highly recommend. And her peculiar challenges, or particular challenges whilst researching this book, are going to form the basis of this talk. Her current project is on the happier subject of recovery and convalescence of both children and adults, which sprung from this project. We would also like to welcome those of you viewing this lecture via Childhood History and Critique, which is a series circulated to about 1,700 scholars through H Childhood and held permanently on the website of the Society for the History of Childhood and Youth. So welcome for tuning in through that website. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd just like to reiterate my thanks to Tessa and Catherine for organising this fantastic conference, and also to everyone's contributions. And I feel that a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today, people already touched on very eloquently. I wish to start this talk with the story of one particular early modern child which I encountered whilst researching for my book, The Sick Child in Early Modern England. And if anybody wants a discount flyer, I've got some here.
Oh, I'm sorry about this. Can we dim the lights at all without? I think it's just on the wall. It's on the wall.
I don't think that's fine anymore.
Is that alright?
It brings to light some of the major intellectual challenges presented by the history of childhood. Born in 1653, Caleb Vernon from Battersea was small of stature and so timorous that his parents could scarce trust him out of their sight. He was also very bright. By the age of 4, he could read the Bible distinctly. One day in 1665, now aged 12, Caleb began to feel hot and feverish. His mother put him to bed, wrapping him in blankets and propping him up with pillows. Over the next month, the illness worsened, and Caleb became so weak that he was not able to be got up out of his bed. Feeling miserable and sore, Caleb asked his parents if some living creature could be brought to his bedside to prevent melancholy thoughts. He suggested a young lamb, pigeon or rabbit. Caleb's parents agreed, deciding that a pet squirrel would be best because it might easily be procured. Later on, Caleb overheard his little sister Nancy asking, "Who shall have Caleb's pet when he is dead?" Caleb told his father, "Now I think I shall die." His father gushed out into tears, and the boy, seeing him, called out, "Father, do not weep, but pray. I long to be with God." He bequeathed all his toys to his sisters Nancy and Betty, and told his mother, "Mother, I love your company dearly." Caleb began to grow breathless as if choked with phlegm, and his father, who was in great care for him, ran downstairs to fetch some medicines for his relief. Returning quickly, he saw his son thrusting first his finger and then his whole hand into his mouth to clear his throat. Hearing his father coming, Caleb gasped, "Oh, Father, what shall I do?" and then immediately lay back, uttered, "God, God," and died. This account is taken from the eulogy of Caleb Vernon, written by his father, Dr. John Vernon, and published in 1666, a year after the boy's death. It cuts to the heart of my motivations as a historian, the desire to capture and convey the profound poignancy of past human experiences. The extract raises questions about the possibilities and limitations of childhood history. Can we trust adults' reports of children's words and actions? How normal or representative was Caleb of children from his era? Is it possible to ever find out how children like Caleb felt about their own lives and impending deaths? Drawing on my experience of researching and writing my book, this talk discusses some of the big challenges in the history of childhood and puts forward some potential strategies for dealing with them, many of which actually people have already touched upon today. To put the discussions in context, I'm going to briefly outline my book's arguments. The subject is children's illness in England between approximately 1580 and 1720, and it takes three perspectives. The first section explores medical perceptions and treatments of sick children, and argues that the young were regarded as physiologically distinct and in need of special medicines. The second part investigates parents' experiences of childhood illness and shows that both mothers and fathers were heavily involved in the care of their sick offspring and that both parties experienced profound grief upon their deaths. The third part sees sickness through the eyes of the child and attempts to reconstruct the emotional, physical and spiritual experiences of illness, pain and death. I argue that children's experiences of sickness were profoundly ambivalent. Illness was often painful, frightening and a source of spiritual anxiety, but it was also a time of love, attention and power and occasionally spiritual joy. It was this final section, on the child's perspective, which I found to be the most challenging. My talk identifies the particular difficulties I encountered in this context. The first, which Peter Stearns has recently pronounced the granddaddy issue faced by historians of childhood, is the virtually unprecedented problem of getting information from children themselves as opposed to adult perspectives. Before the 19th century, few documents survive which were penned by children. And even when children did leave records, their writings cannot be taken as clear windows into their lives, since they were often corrected or edited by adults. Just to give one example, in the mid-16th century, 11-year-old James Bassett from Devonshire wrote to his mother from his school in Paris, telling her that he had a sore eye, but that otherwise he was perfectly happy. A few days later, he wrote again, stating that his previous letter had been dictated sore against my will by his schoolmaster. The boy was miserable, and he complained that in the event of his being ill-handled, he would not have been permitted to say so, as was the case for many of his schoolfellows who had been ill a month and yet were forced to write home saying they were merry and in good health. And I think this rare example of the censorship of a child's letter reminds us that we have to be very careful, I think, about using these sources. However, I want to emphasise that I think this problem may not be insurmountable. One possible solution to the lack of children's written records is to find special contexts in which their voices were privileged in adults' writings, ideally verbatim. One such context is illness. Acutely aware of the likelihood of death, parents and other adults recorded the thoughts, words and actions of their sick children in unprecedented detail, conscious that these might soon be cherished as last memories. The resulting evidence, though written by adults, provides rare and intimate insights into the preoccupations of children. At bedtime in 1625, 3-year-old Elizabeth Wallington from London, then being merry, said to her father, "Father, I go abroad tomorrow and buy you a plum pie." The reason this everyday sentence was recorded by Elizabeth's father in his diary was that, as he said, these were the last words that I did hear my sweet child speak, for a few hours later the very pangs of death seized upon her, which were very grievous unto us the beholders, and she died at 4 o'clock in the morning. It's just written at the bottom here, it goes on to the top of the page. Diary entries such as this one provide only snapshots into a child's life. To find more extended records of children's conversations, we can turn to eulogies and pious biographies. These are accounts of the lives and deaths of particularly virtuous Protestant children, compiled and composed by relatives or clergymen. The functions of these documents were to provide didactic models for readers about godly living and dying, and to commemorate the deceased child. In the case of children who recovered, the purpose was to glorify God for his deliverance. The eulogy of Caleb Vernon, with which this talk opened, exemplifies this genre. penned by his father as he sat by his son's deathbed. It's over 80 pages in length, and purports that all the writings are faithfully set down from Caleb's own mouth. Of course, such claims of authenticity are no guarantees of accuracy, and it seems highly unlikely that parents could have remembered every utterance, however profound. Like all sources, biographies and eulogies are subject to processes of authorial and editorial filtering. Nonetheless, I think these sources remain highly valuable owing to the sheer volume of information they provide about childhood. Indeed, as well as offering insights into illness and death, biographies and eulogies shed light on practically every aspect of children's lives, from bedtime and mealtime routines to school antics and friendships. And I think particularly noteworthy are the detailed descriptions of sibling interactions, from which we can learn much about sibling bonds, a topic which has received much less historical attention compared to other family relationships. And to give a little flavour, the biography of 11-year-old Martha Hatfield, depicted here from Yorkshire, describes the close relationship enjoyed between Martha and her older sister Hannah. When Martha fell sick in 1652, Hannah spent much of her time in her sister's bedchamber, keeping her company and helping their mother to nurse her. Fearing that death was imminent, Hannah cried, "Must these pretty little hands go into the grave and rot in the dust?" When Martha then began to recover, several months later, it was Hannah who took her up and set her upon her feet for the first time in 9 months. The two girls were seen rejoicing and laughing and embracing one another. I think that the affection is palpable. We might expect these sources to only showcase harmonious sibling relationships, but this is not the case. Caleb Vernon, for instance, although very fond of his sisters, found them irritating on occasions. When they were playing noisily in his bedchamber, he called out, "You take the ready way to hurt me," and he called his mother in to tell them off. There's also, I think, a hint of sibling rivalry between his two sisters over who should inherit some of his belongings, including his pet. These sources reveal that sibling relationships continued after death in children's imaginations and dreams. Particularly noteworthy is recorded in Ralph Jocelyn's diary, a clergyman from Essex. I think 4 years after the death of his daughter Mary, her brother Tom describes the very, very vivid dream he has about visiting Mary in heaven. So in short, I think that eulogies and biographies have the potential to illuminate previously unexplored aspects of childhood. As well as using verbatim accounts of children's words, another strategy to help counter the problem of a lack of first-hand evidence from children is to analyse autobiographies. Though written in adulthood, these sources describe memories from childhood, including incidents of illness. The Puritan merchant and astrologer Samuel Jeek recounted at least 12 bouts of sickness that had occurred to him before the age of 15, and noted that his recovery from measles in 1656 at the age of 4 is one of the first things that I remember. Illness seems to have been a rite of passage for many young people, and the moment at which the hotter sort of Protestants underwent a spiritual conversion, so it's not surprising that it occupies a central place in childhood narratives. Of course, as some of the people have pointed out today, the memories conveyed in these documents are imperfect. As time passed, authors frequently forgot details of their childhoods. Nevertheless, some recollections appear to be so lucid that they can be viewed a bit more confidently. Just to give you one example, the dictionary writer Samuel Johnson remembered his trip to London to be treated for the King's evil, scrofula. He wrote, "I always retain some memory of this journey, though I was then but 30 months old. I remembered a little dark room behind the kitchen, where the jackweight fell through a hole in the floor, into which I once slipped my leg. I seem to remember that I played with a string and a bell, which my cousin Isaac Johnson gave me, and that there was a cat with a white collar and a dog called Chops that leaped over a stick." Johnson seems to have been captivated by the new environment in which he found himself. Occasions of serious illness may have been particularly memorable because they were events considered at the time to be so, and also they were associated with extreme bodily sensations and emotions. Having said all this, I think nowadays historians do seem to be increasingly taking a viewpoint that the accuracy of personal memories may not be as important as they might seem. Misremembering may in fact be equally illuminating because it reveals how people wanted to remember their childhoods. So in short, Although early modern children did not leave many written records, there exists plenty of detailed second-hand accounts from which it's possible to infer much about the experience of childhood. So the second challenge that I'd like to discuss is the temptation to assess the authenticity of past children's behaviour according to modern-day knowledge of children. Whilst, when I was reading the primary sources, I often found myself accepting what seemed familiar and childlike, whilst questioning or dismissing the more alien elements of children's behaviour as fabricated by the authors. So, for example, in the case of Caleb Vernon, I accepted without question his preoccupation with pets and toys and his love for his parents. But I was immediately sceptical about his resignation to death and his precocious piety. By the same token, it is tempting to regard stories of naughty, rebellious children as more true to life than accounts of exemplary behaviour, and this observation is made by the historian Alison Shell. This tendency can be illustrated by comparing two very different accounts of a child's response to communal prayer for recovery: 13-year-old James Barrow from London and 4-year-old Mary Stubbs from Norfolk. James Barrow, who was believed to be possessed in the early 1660s, found the prayer days that had been organised on his behalf tedious. On the third morning of communal prayer, he cried out, "What? 3 days? 2 days was enough. What? Nothing but pray? What? All mad? Will you kill yourselves with praying? 3 days is too much." Incidentally, James's family interpreted his outburst as the voice of the devil. But we might prefer to see it as an example of teenage rebellion against a strict religious upbringing. By contrast, the biographer of young Mary Stubbs, who was sick of a languishing disease in 1683, wrote that her delight was so very great in those days of prayer that she would weep and mourn when her visitors took their leave of her. I think we could be forgiven for thinking that James Barrow's account is more credible, whilst Mary's precocious godliness may have been exaggerated. After all, religious acts such as prayer, together with resignation to death, were taken as signs of a person's inward faith and likely salvation. Consequently, parents like Mr. and Mrs. Stubbs may have wished to emphasise this behaviour as a way to reassure themselves that their daughter had gone to heaven, where eventually they would all be reunited. In the case of published biographies and eulogies, this was especially likely since authors wished to create a powerful didactic message about appropriate behaviour on the deathbed. And I think parents may have also put pressure on their children, inadvertently perhaps, to voice more comfort in prayer or resignation to death than they were actually feeling, because they desperately wanted to believe the child would go to heaven. This may have been the case for 11-year-old John Harvey from London in the 1660s. His mother told him, "If thou hast but an assurance of God's love, I should not have been so much troubled," to which he replied, "I am assured, dear mother, that my sins are forgiven, and I shall go to heaven." The boy admitted that nothing grieved him more than the sorrow that he saw his mother to be in for his death, from which I think we can deduce that he may have been trying hard to comfort his mother with his pious expressions. Nevertheless, I think we should not be too cynical about the authenticity of children's piety. Alec Ryrie has shown that pious Protestants were acutely afraid of committing the sins of hypocrisy and false faith. Such fears must surely have acted as a deterrent to avert exaggeration or invention. Furthermore, I think our suspicions may be based partly on our present-day prejudices, and as such it's necessary to make a conscious effort to suspend our own ideas about children and instead immerse ourselves in contemporary beliefs about their capacities. In the early modern period, children enjoyed a special religious status. They were thought to be especially beloved by God and capable of startling divine insight. This is because they had committed fewer sins than adults. Childhood was the most innocent part of our lives, despite the inheritance of original sin. These ideas are rooted in the biblical passage, Matthew 18, verses 3 to 5, which begins, "Jesus called a little child unto him, and set him in the midst of them, and said, Verily I say unto you, except you be converted and become as little children, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven." The spiritual potential of children was also indicated by God's decision to send his Son into the world as a little infant. Given this cultural backdrop and the intense religious conditioning of children from an early age, I think it's quite conceivable that young people would have been able to attain sophisticated knowledge of Christian practices and beliefs which may then have influenced and shaped their experiences of illness and death. Or put another way, since adults' expectations strongly influence children's behaviour, it's likely that children who are brought up in environments that nurtured precocious spirituality may sometimes have been able to meet and even surpass these expectations. So in other words, I think we should resist the urge to dismiss children like Mary Stubbs as improbable caricatures, because I think such a view may partly be a reflection of the disparity between early modern and modern ideas about children and religion. The third challenge I faced in my research is one that's not confined to the history of childhood, namely the notorious difficulty of accessing the physical and emotional feelings of people from the past. To recap, in my book, I wanted to uncover children's experiences of physical pain, together with their emotional responses to sickness and death. This was difficult for various reasons, not least due to the possible gap between the expression and the experience of physical or emotional feelings. As Barbara Rosenwein and other leading scholars in the history of emotion and pain have pointed out, whilst it is possible to understand how people articulated and represented how they felt, we cannot know how the individual actually feels in a certain situation. In other words, there's a distinction between the expression and the experience of an emotion or physical sensation. It means that the accounts of children's feelings do not tell us how they actually felt. And I think that contributing to these difficulties is the fact that pain and emotions are incoherent biological states which resist easy or adequate verbalisation. It's well known that any extreme feeling, physical or emotional, is hard to describe. Elaine Scarry famously asserted that pain is an interior and unshareable experience which actively destroys language. This notion was also voiced in the early modern period. Timothy Rogers, a clergyman from London, wrote in a sermon on illness and recovery, "Great griefs, as well as mighty joys, exceed all our words, and bitterness is not to be described." The difficulty of verbalising pain was thought to be even more acute when it came to children. Early modern doctors routinely complained that in children pain is hard to be known because they cannot relate it. Although parents sometimes attempted to describe their children's pains in their diaries and letters, many recognised that they could never fully appreciate their offspring's sufferings. After the death of her daughter, Eliza Maria, in the late 17th century, Mary Chudley from Devon composed a poem which reads, "Wrapped by convulsive pain she meekly lies, and gazes on me with imploring eyes, with eyes which beg relief, but all in vain. I see, but cannot ease her pain. She must the burden unassisted bear, I cannot with her in her tortures share." This mother felt isolated from her daughter, unable to share her sufferings. So in short, due to the very nature of pain and the emotions, the task of accessing the child's experience of illness from the words of others is a great challenge. However, I think we should not lose heart. Whilst the emotions and sufferings of children from the past cannot be accessed in an unmediated form, it is possible to catch a glimpse of their feelings. Various techniques can be used to do this. I'm going to start with the emotions and then I'll talk a little about pain. The main strategy I used in my book to investigate children's emotional experiences was to find out how people at the time conceptualised the emotions, and in particular the emotions of children. As Thomas Dixon has shown, our concept of the emotions is very different from the early modern one. For a start, the word emotion was not used in this context. Instead, people referred to the passions of the soul. Passions were defined as physical movements of the middle part of the soul, called the sensitive or the animal soul, instigated for the preservation of the human being. They were depicted as powerful liquids which surge through the body, bringing physical effects. You can see here that the soul is depicted as a triangle. The top part, the rational soul, is unique to human beings, and that controls reason, understanding, and will. The sensitive or animal soul is the middle part, and that's we share with animals, and it controls the passions, the senses, and animation. And then finally, the bottom part, the vegetal soul, we share with vegetables, and that is in charge of the basic functions of nutrition, growth, and generation. So the passions come from this middle part of the soul. The body and soul were envisaged as close friends or playmates who loved one another dearly and sympathised with each other's sufferings. As such, the pain of illness evoked painful passions, and vice versa. Children's passions were considered to be especially forceful, owing to the distinctive humoral constitution of the young. The humours were the four special substances which made up living creatures, each of which was characterised by its level of heat and moisture. So to explain, children's bodies were thought to be more moist than those of adults. Ageing was a drying out process, and they abounded in the humour blood, which was warm and moist. This liquid was imagined as to seep into the mind or soul, where it partially incapacitated the rational soul, the top part. And this part was the part responsible for controlling and disciplining the passions. As a result, the passions of children were thought to be inordinate. As the physician J.S. put it in 1664, in children, reason is drowned and drunk with humours. The humidity of children also explained this age group's distinctive emotional dispositions. They were thought to be more prone to laughter and cheerfulness than adults and old people. This was confirmed by the philosopher Nicholas Cufferto, who stated, "Joy is moist and hot, and therefore is easily framed in the hearts of children, which are of like humidity." With these ideas about children's passions in mind, I was better equipped to understand their emotional experiences of illness, and particularly those which had initially seemed rather implausible. For instance, sick children sometimes found that at the height of illness, the tender care shown by parents, together with the constant reminders of the happiness of heaven, elicited such strong comfort that a sensation of physical pain was lessened. Just to give one example, in 1661, 10-year-old Mary Warren mused that, "Although I am very sore, from the crown of my head to the sole of my foot, I am so full of comfort and joy that I do feel but little of my pain." Now, upon first reading, I thought this seemed slightly kind of far-fetched, but when I considered that children's joy was believed to be uniquely powerful, it began to be seen more feasible. The perceived sympathy between the mind and body meant that the happiness of the former tempered the pains of the latter. Even if children themselves were unaware of these philosophical ideas, it's probable that their emotions were influenced by adults' expectations. Turning to the question of how to access the child's experience of pain, I'm indebted to the techniques of the pain historians Mary Ann Lund and Joanna Burke, who recommend carefully analysing the metaphors and imagery that's used to describe physical suffering. The underlying supposition to this method is that the types of words that are used to describe pain and the meanings they hold may actually affect the sensation of suffering. As such, by examining the language, we come closer to accessing the experience of pain. I found that a great variety of metaphors were used to describe children's pains, ranging from torture and burning to war wounds and bee stings. To show how these metaphors might have shaped children's experiences, I'll use the example of torture. Children and their relatives often describe pain as racking or tormenting. This is perhaps one of the most common metaphors that was used. The idea of torture would have been very familiar to most educated Protestant children, because one of the first books they would have laid their eyes on was John Fox's Acts and Monuments, which depicts in graphic words and images the excruciating tortures inflicted on Christian martyrs since the early church. I've argued in my book that the connotations of martyrdom may have exerted a positive impact on children's sufferings, serving to ennoble their pains, and children often mention martyrs when they're enduring pain. Just to give one example, 12-year-old Charles Bridgman in 1632, when considering his pains, he called to mind that martyr Thomas Bilney, who had burned his own finger in a candle to give himself a foretaste of what it would be like to burn at stake. Charles clearly identified with this martyr, and he declared, "Oh, had I lived then, I would have run through the fire to have gone to Christ." Thus, I think through examining these metaphors, we might see some sort of insight, I think, into the experience of suffering. So far, I've suggested that part of the difficulty of accessing the sufferings of people from the past is that it cannot be shared. I want to point out at this point that this is not always the case, and I found it quite striking how frequently early modern parents did seem to feel the child's pain. Parents and children were described as being of one flesh, which meant that they were capable of experiencing compassion to a unique degree. This notion was articulated clearly by the Oxford theologian John Owen in his 1680 commentary of 2 Samuel 12, verses 15 to 23. The passage concerns David's agony upon witnessing the illness of his son. Owen states, David stood in the relation of a father whose bowels must needs yearn over a sick and languishing child. When he saw it restless and tumbling up and down for ease, panting and heaving and bemoaning itself with sighs and groans that were unutterable, how could a father forbear weeping and making great lamentations when he beheld his own flesh and blood, the bone of his bone, to be in such great affliction? Philosophers acknowledged that the feelings of parents in these situations exceeded the bounds of empathy. Parents were practically experiencing their children's sufferings at first hand. Nicholas Cufferto confirmed that those persons tied unto us by blood, such as children, touch us so near that we have a feeling more violent than pity. We are full of horror and amazement. Given the degree of parental compassion, I would suggest that parents' descriptions of their offspring's pains do yield insights into children's experiences. Groans and moans might not sound to us like very articulate expressions of pain, but early modern people believed that these were perhaps the most penetrating forms of communication, which brought onlookers to a keen appreciation of the person's suffering. Timothy Rogers, the clergyman, considered how uncomfortable it is to the relations and friends of the sick to see him struggling and crying under pains which tear him to pieces. Their shrill cries and their doleful groans pierce our hearts. The sense of hearing was regarded as the most direct route to the heart, through which the passions were moved violently. So in short, the acute pity of parents for their children's pain may render second-hand accounts of suffering more useful for revealing children's experiences than we might first suppose. So to summarise this section, I hope that through these methods of carefully attending to the meanings and language of early modern emotions and pain, it is possible to come a little closer to the child's viewpoint. The fourth challenge to discuss concerns our own emotional and moral responses to the treatment of children from the past. Childhood is a deeply emotive topic and one which elicits strong feelings in us. It's hard not to impose our own ideas about appropriate parenting and to make ethical judgments about past practices. When I first started researching sick children, two particular practices stood out as unbearably cruel. The first was a tendency of parents and other adults to encourage dying children to dwell on their sins and contemplate the possibility of death and damnation. Mary Stubbs, who we encountered earlier, is a case in point. Her biographer wrote that at the beginning of her illness, she seemed very unwilling to hear anything spoken to her of her death, and showed a great dislike and would be very angry if anyone mentioned it. Yet her parents did not forbear to talk to her about her death, and continually asked her whither she would go if she died. At first she replied she did not know, but afterwards, the question being repeated, she said that she should go to heaven. Her mother then told her all that died did not go thither, at which point Mary began to cry and mourn for her sins, fearing she should go to hell. Thus Mary's mother was directly responsible for inspiring her daughter's fears. Religious books describe in terrifying detail the horrors of hell. An author of A Voice from Heaven to the Youth of Great Britain, published in 1690, tells his young readers, "Consider, you may perish as young as you are. There are small chips as well as great logs in the fire of hell. The child that will tell a lie must one day roar in hell for a drop of water to cool his tongue." This book is illustrated with a vivid woodcut of hell depicted here. All this, I thought, seemed just unthinkably cruel. One can only imagine the great terror it must have awakened in children. The other early modern practice which initially evoked my consternation was medical treatment. Early modern medicine could be unpleasant and sometimes left the patient feeling worse than before, even if the intention was to restore health. A letter by 15-year-old Edmund Verney from Buckinghamshire, which he sent to his father in 1653, reveals how uncomfortable treatment could be. At this time, it concerns a brace that he wore to correct his crooked back. He wrote, "After first wearing the brace, I found that I was in great pain. Each time they tightened it, it seemed worse than I could bear because I felt I was being pressed. The leather, covering my brace on the inside, when all 9 screws are in place, causes the continual heat of my body, which is trapped in me always, with the effect that the heat gives off such a strong smell that it's quite intolerable, and each day ruins the white shirts I'm wearing. This letter is all the more valuable because it's written by the boy himself as opposed to an adult observer. Other treatments that were notoriously unpleasant were vomits, purges and blisters, all of which the physician Francis Glisson pronounced unpleasing, full of pain and molestation to children. Mary Dubois from Hampshire complained that the vomit she administered to her daughter Lucy made her the sickest creature she had ever seen, vomiting from 5 o'clock this morning until past 6 at night. The anxious mother lamented, "If the medicine does not cease working, I would fear it will be very sad." It's hard not to agree with the historian Guy Williams in his book The Age of Agony, that the horrors endured by the sick scarce bear repeating. However, I think it is important to avoid making moral judgments of these kinds on the grounds that they do not actually take into account the motivations that lay behind the practices. Once we understand why children were treated in these ways, the practices begin to appear slightly less abhorrent. So returning to the hell example, the intentions behind questioning children about sin and damnation were actually usually benevolent. At this time it was believed that the best way to reach a state of joyful assurance about heaven was to first experience the fear of hell and guilt for sins. Theologians confirmed, we must first go by the gates of heaven to have hell to heaven. This is because human beings could only attain forgiveness when they had fully repented, and in turn, true repentance was only possible upon a confrontation with the horror of sin and damnation. Alec Riley has shown that the fear of hell was also the best antidote to a far worse fear of hypocrisy and false assurance. Consequently, emotions like fear and guilt, although unpleasant, were supposed to be transient steps on the path to a joyful assurance of forgiveness and salvation. Sick children could thus rest assured that these emotions were normal, necessary, and temporary. And I think this is very evident in the eulogies and pious biographies, wherein the children invariably get through the guilt and fear stage and go on to die peaceful, resigned, and in some cases, ecstatic deaths. Mary Stubbs, after her initial fears of hell, grew to a full assurance of her salvation and would say, "Oh, I am so full of joy because I know I shall go to heaven." And children seem to have had a very vivid imagination of heaven, often describing it in great detail what it looks like. The fear of separation from parents was also greatly mitigated through these thoughts. Mary told her mother, "Do not mourn for me, for you shall come to me, and we shall be in heaven together." Just as parents played a part in evoking children's initial fears, they were also responsible for bringing comfort and assurance of heaven. I think it might also do us good to consider that modern approaches to death may not be ideal either. If early modern parents talk too much to their children about death, we could accuse ourselves of talking too little on the subject. Death is a fact of life, and children today might be comforted to know that it's okay to talk about it openly and ask questions. So that's the hell example. So returning, if you can remember, to the medical example, the urge to cast moral judgments on this aspect of children's care can also be resisted by exploring the theory that underlay it. Edmund Verney's brace, for example, was supposed to gradually mould his young frame and correct his crooked back before it became incurable. It was believed in this period, as I mentioned, that the bodies of young people were malleable owing to their high moisture content. Their bones were compared to a young tender root or twig of a tree which could be straightened through applying a splint. The reason Edmund's father opted for this treatment when his son was in his teens was it was believed that older children were better able to bear discomfort than infants, and this is because their brains are drying out, their souls are getting a bit drier, and so the rational soul could gradually exert a bit more influence over the passions. If he had waited any longer, the cure would probably have proved more difficult, on the grounds that with age the bones become dry, stiff and stubborn. In any case, the treatment seemed to work for Edmund, or at least he thought it did. He wrote it to his father a little while later, declaring triumphantly, "I may truly say the cure is almost perfected." He added with glee, I'm almost as tall, if not taller, than my cousin Spencer. The use of other medical treatments, which to us might seem ludicrous, such as giving a laxative to a child who is vomiting, can also be rendered less ridiculous once we consider the rationale that underpinned it. According to ancient Hippocratic and Galenic medical traditions, the symptoms of a disease signified the therapeutic intentions of the body's healing agent, nature. Evacuative symptoms like diarrhoea signified that nature was trying to get rid of certain bad humours that were in that part of the body. As such, the administration of an evacuative medicine, such as an emetic, when the patient had diarrhoea, was believed to support nature's healing efforts by diverting the bad humours from the bowels to the stomach, where the matter could be safely expelled through vomiting. In effect, one evacuation cured another. The role of medicine at this time was expressed through the famous axiom, the physician is nature's servant. Physic was supposed to reinforce and support what nature, or the body, was already doing. It's also important, I think, to point out that children's medical treatments were probably less unpleasant than those given to adults, if that's any comfort. Doctors warn that children, by reason of the weakness of their bodies, cannot undergo severe methods or strong medicines. Children were less likely to be given evacuative treatments than adults, and instead were usually treated with milder medicines, such as topical ointments and baths and non-evacuating internal medicines. Various adaptations were also made to render medicines more pleasant. Sugar was added to improve the taste, pain relief was prioritised, and doses were lessened. Thus things weren't quite so terrible as I first thought. So in short, I think that before we cast judgments on past childhood practices, it's useful to first interrogate the motivations that lay behind them. On those occasions when there is overt child cruelty, we can just let the sources speak for themselves. The final, but by no means least significant challenge that I encountered in my research, and I think in a way is the one I dealt with least effectively, is the underrepresentation of the lower socioeconomic groups from the primary sources. Few sources survive which provide detailed qualitative evidence of the experiences of poorer children. In the case of diarists, autobiographers and letter writers, the majority were landowners from the middling and upper classes engaged in clerical, legal or parliamentary careers. Finance probably affected many aspects of children's experiences of illness, such as the quality of medical care that could be afforded, the physical environment in which the sick child lay, and the level of religious education provided on the subject of death and the afterlife. Poorer children may have also been more vulnerable to disease in the first place, owing to lower levels of nutrition and damp and overcrowded housing. Having said this, not all the children in the sources came from wealthy households. The Puritan diarist Nehemiah Wallington, whose diary entry we saw earlier with his daughter Elizabeth, was a woodturner from London. Furthermore, the elites were not immune from financial trouble. The early modern period was a time of political instability, with fluctuating levels of religious persecution. At many times, lay and clerical families found themselves in financial straits owing to the punitive measures imposed by Parliament or the monarchy. In the case of biographies and eulogies, the socio-economic representation is actually much wider than we might think. According to Ralph Holbrook, it stretches from the higher clergy to the very poor. And likewise, doctors' casebooks frequently mention children of lower social status. In the 1730s, Dr. William Brownrigg from Cumbria treated the baby boy of Henry Hutchinson, a plasterer. Nevertheless, there is still an undeniable skew towards the wealthy echelons, which in my book I did try as far as I could to correct. And I found that two particular types of sources were particularly useful for providing insights into poorer children's experiences. Firstly, records from the proceedings of the Old Bailey, which include witness statements and other types of document from the period after 1674. Since these sources are recorded and edited by adult scribes, they can't be taken as clear lenses into the experiences of poor children, but they do nevertheless shed some light on the lives and deaths of people below middling rank. For example, I found depositions especially useful when I came to ask how widespread was the fear of hell across the social spectrum. I found that the threat of hell was used to extract information from child opponents of modest status, and it seems to have been a standard technique. In 1678, 9-year-old Elizabeth Hopkins, the daughter of a lowly craftsman, only confessed to having been raped when her family warned her that she would be in danger of hanging in hell unless she spoke out. Clearly, the child had sufficient knowledge of the afterlife to be convinced by this threat. The other type of source I used for investigating poor children's illness experiences were popular ballads, one-sheet tales written in verse on a huge range of topics, from murder to biblical healings. These texts were commonly chanted and sung in public places, pasted to pub walls, and shared and borrowed between neighbours and friends, and therefore it's probable that they would have been within earshot of most levels of society. Whilst this doesn't mean that these documents constitute a mirror of the beliefs and experiences of the poor, it is likely that they held some resonance with their consumers in order for them to be commercially viable. A ballad I found particularly useful in my research was the children's example up here. Published in 1700, it narrates the holy life and death of Mrs. Johnson's child of Barnet, a young girl. Remarkably similar to the pious biographies, it reveals how widely diffused this genre had become in early modern culture. Various insights are provided into this girl's experience. She did complain that she did feel a tormenting pain and was attended by doctors with speed in her time of need. When she lay dying, she told her mother, "Come kiss your child and don't complain, we only part to meet again." The author claimed the story was true, but even if it wasn't, it demonstrates that contemporaries thought it quite believable that children of all socioeconomic levels could reach a state of resignation and happiness about dying. So in short, by broadening our net of primary sources beyond the personal documents of the elites, it's possible to gain some degree of understanding about the expected attitudes and experiences of poorer children. So now to conclude, I think the single greatest challenge in the history of childhood is not so much accessing children's experiences, but rather overcoming our own doubts about the possibility of doing so. And having said that statement, I'd like to now add a caveat, and that is that from listening to all the talks today, I was really delighted to see that people do seem to be quite optimistic about our capacity to access the child's experience. I'll end this talk by outlining 3 final thoughts about strategies which might help us in this quest. First, as I've already suggested, I think it's useful to uncover special contexts in which the voices of children have been preserved in unusual detail, such as illness. Reported speech is the next best thing to first-hand accounts, and I think it has tremendous potential. Second, it would be valuable, I think, to set about compiling sourcebook anthologies of children's voices, which would provide a starting point for anyone who wanted to explore history from the child's point of view. And I mean, this may already be in progress, I don't know, but I think that if we were able to collect up children's voices in one place, we'd be surprised by the richness and variety of the evidence. If everyone could just pool their resources and send in their extracts of children's words, I think that would be brilliant. Over the years, this strategy has proved fruitful for many other allegedly inaccessible and silent groups, such as women, the poor, and the elderly, so it might also be useful for children. And the third and final suggestion, which Tessa has already mentioned, and seems to have made a lot more progress on than I have, is to speak to children about our research. Although children today are not the same as the children of the past, I think they do have unique insights into what it's like to be a child. Last year I was involved in Cambridge's History for Schools outreach programme, and I led a workshop called Inside the Sick Chamber for 9 to 14-year-olds. I gave the children a variety of colourful extracts from paintings, letters, doctors' casebooks, and they had a go at being an early modern physician, tasting and smelling some rather unpleasant-looking flasks of pretend urine. I was taken aback by the children's imaginative and empathetic observations about the sources, as well as their frankness and clarity of thought. Given that death is still taboo in schools and in society at large, it may be that these sorts of dialogues would be a double benefit to historians and to children themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, that was a really fantastic and positive way to round off the day. today. I think that all of us here can probably relate to some, if not all, of the challenges discussed in this paper. Certainly I recognise the temptation to make assumptions based on our own knowledge of children and of being children. We all remember what it was like to be a child, and that can really inform how we approach work for good and bad, particularly when we're looking at, as you say, emotive subjects. It was a sort of a good reminder to avoid making anachronistic value judgments about the evidence that we consult. And thank you particularly for the really positive strategies that you've suggested, and I'm sure we can all take a lot away from this, about, for example, to understand the emotional landscape and language of the periods we're looking at, about ways of thinking of creative approaches to finding out about the lives of poorer children, for example, court records and various other sources. I love the fact that you suggest pooling resources. I mean, this is something that I think we can all take away and think about how we can think about doing that. And speaking to children of today, I think, I was really fascinated by Tessa's suggestions, as you said, about ways of consulting and thinking about the evidence from the past through the eyes of today's children. It's a great idea. But overall, thank you for the positivity that's come. As you say, throughout the day there's been so much positivity about acknowledging the challenges, but also acknowledging that there is a lot out there. There's loads for us to be getting on with. So thank you very much, and I'd like to open out to the rest of your questions. Thank you, Claire.
Well, this is just a small point really, but I was very interested in the way that the pamphlets you showed had a very generic type of title, like The Complete Scholar, The Wise Virgin, The Children's Example. So this is obviously, a convention, but I just wondered if you wanted to say more about that. It's sort of quite interesting the way they take something generic like that and then relate it to a specific child. And I can't think of examples of that from my period, but it might be I'm just missing something.
That's very interesting. I hadn't really thought about that, because I suppose these things are actually aimed specifically at children, and usually in the preface the author states this is written for the use of little children as well as adults. And so you'd almost expect it to perhaps be made a bit more child-friendly in appearance, or maybe made a little bit different from other texts, but it doesn't seem to be in terms of the appearance, except for the inclusion of more of these images, like the hell image. I suppose it could be because this is part of a genre, and particularly the eulogies are quite similar really to the adults' eulogies, and the genre of funeral sermons, which often include a biography, kind of mini biography, and eulogy of the person that's died. So it might just be, it might really just be due to that link, that generic link between other types.
It's just like what I was interested in, it doesn't start off saying the life and death of X. It starts off the complete scholar. It's completely selfish, so I was thinking, how would I look this up? I'm the catalogue. Oh, I would have a title like that.
It's yes,
and
actually, that's a very good point. I think it probably reflects the fact that these are ultimately eulogies, and they want to remember the child in the best light, and the complete scholar is probably a kind of a way of praising Caleb for being intelligent and for being so bright and mature and precocious. And the wise virgin, I suppose, again, wisdom is a trait that was particularly celebrated in women. That was something that women were capable of, and perhaps emphasising her virginity would, I suppose, demonstrate this as a young person. So it might be part of that, but I think rather than having something like the life and death of this child, they want to kind of appeal to the commemorative function, I think, of these sources.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Can I, rather than a question, this is a kind of general point. Just picking up, Hannah, from what you said in your last few words about the very positive response you had from the children in Cambridge and their frank and clear thinking, their frankness and their clear thinking. I think one of the things that's kind of generally come up today is how remarkable children are. not as able as... There's a tendency to think they're not, but you know, we've seen they can work in factories, they can read the New Testament when they're 4, they can be sent miles away from their parents and construct a way of kind of coping. So I think that's a really important thing.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, I think that's very true. I think perhaps sometimes we underestimate children, and certainly that was something I found most. I really felt great admiration for lots of children I was reading about, and their kind of maturity. But by saying that, I don't want to kind of argue that. I don't want to be arguing there wasn't a concept of children being different and needing more support than adults. They definitely, these children were remarkable in a sense. They did elicit unusual commendation because they were being so precocious. But yes, I think expectations definitely were very high in this period.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Just on the point of listening to children's voices now, even I kind of want to sound a note of caution, I'm afraid, because even though everybody here can see the kind of value and the sort of imaginative and also empirical benefits to be derived from it, I've actually met with quite a lot of resistance from people in more traditional literature and history backgrounds whose critique is always, what can children now tell us about children then? It's not the same. They don't have the historical information. Why are you going to these unskilled people? And meeting that critique is something we need to kind of think about how to make a critique, I suppose. But my question, Hannah, was, I was struck from your examples by how many of them were nonconformist writers, and you pointed out the kind of paternal narratives, and I thought not just paternal but often ministerial too. So I wondered if you could reflect a bit more on the kind of, I know you talked about this, but the specific challenges of kind of working through these hierarchies of power, discursive power, and whether you've done any work, I'm sure you have, but whether you could tell us about any work you've done about gender and narrative, and whether you kind of triangulate mother's reports with father's reports to kind of get to what the child did say.
Yes, well, thank you, Tessa. Yes, that's a very important point, and I think it's something which I really did find was a bit of a struggle in the fact that most of the detailed evidence is written by nonconformists. Having said that, I recently, in my new project on recovery, I've been keeping a database of trying to work out what religious affiliation each author is kind of sizing, and I found that a remarkable number of them seem to be in the middle. They're either kind of reluctant conformists or they're kind of moderate non-conformists. And in fact, some of the people I quoted today didn't ultimately conformed, but clearly had sympathies with non-conformed. So I think it's very, very hard to kind of put them into these categories and to make hard and fast distinctions between them. I'm inclined to go with kind of Alex Walsh and Patrick Collins' idea that this is really about temperature rather than substance, and these people are not abnormal, but they're expressing their spiritual emotions and their beliefs in a more intense, expressive way than perhaps other people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their beliefs would have been significantly different from other people's. I suppose, in terms of how to deal with it, I think it's really just a case of looking for more sources, particularly letters, I think, because letters tend to be, especially personal family letters, they represent, I think, a wider religious spectrum, and particularly getting at non-clerical families. And I suppose the sources I shared with you today, because they're the most detailed, I've used those sources, but in fact, the letters and the diaries and autobiographies that are written by women and non-ministers do kind of hint at similar experiences, but they're just less detailed, and therefore it's harder to kind of make the points that I was wanting to make. But there are little snippets of it in other sources which hint to me that this is something that's not just confined to those Puritan families. But of course it's very, very difficult to prove that's the case. And I think in my new project I'm making a bit more of a real concerted effort to try and find some other additional perspectives. The gender comment. Yes, I was very interested in gender, both in terms of how it influenced the child's experience of illness and the parents' experience. And I found that when it came to children, it didn't really seem to make a great deal of difference. Girls and boys from really, because I stopped in about the age of about 15, that sort of age, and they seem to, they're given the same sort of care when they're sick. There doesn't seem to be any preference in terms of the quality or amount spent on the child's medicines for girls and boys. And they do similar things when they're preparing for death. Girls are just as likely, if not in fact more likely, they seem to make more of these speeches, admonitions to their parents and their siblings about religious issues, which is one of the things they do to demonstrate the presence of God's grace and in their souls. So I felt it didn't really seem to make a drastic difference to children's experiences. I think perhaps there was a little bit of gendering of the when it came to the expression of pain, and I noticed that boys were sometimes told they were a real hero or they were very brave. Perhaps a little bit more than girls, but even so, it's not. Girls are also told they're courageous. It's very hard to really distinguish very clearly. And I think my argument in my first section of my book about the medical treatment of children also kind of emphasised the similarity of medical treatments of girls and boys. And I think until the age of puberty, their humoral constitution was really defined by their humidity, and that was the same for girls and boys. I think that's probably why they were more likely to be distinguished according to their size, if they were big or little, or fat or thin. In terms of parents, I was expecting to find more of a difference than I did. One of the most striking things, I think, that I found was the great tenderness of fathers to their children, to really quite young children, including girls. And I think in the historiography I'd expected that women would have nursed children, particularly girls, and that fathers perhaps with young children wouldn't have had a kind of active role, but in fact they did. And Isaac Archer, who I don't think I mentioned today, who's one of my favourite diarists, talks about how he sat with his arm around his 7-year-old daughter Frances all night because the mother could not help her through grief, and he felt that he could comfort her best. And so you get a real sense of the father's tenderness towards the child. And when it comes to dying and death, again, I'd kind of wondered whether perhaps mothers would have grieved more for children than fathers because of this emphasis on male rationality and the importance placed on that trait in men. But again, it wasn't really the case, and I think that perhaps fathers took as their example Job from the Bible, and they saw that it was perfectly acceptable for a man to display wild grief when perhaps not so much Job, because he was quite stoical, but the example of David, when his son was ill, he was very much expressing untrammelled grief while the child was ill. As soon as the child then died, he tried to restrain and moderate his grief because there was nothing he could do to bring his child back, so there was a kind of difference there. Having said that, I did often find fathers saying that they were able to comfort their wives and that they were able to suppress some of their grief, and they didn't deny it. They weren't saying they felt any less grief than their wives, but they were saying that they did their very best to use what arguments they had to compose their emotions. And I think this ties into the idea that in this period emotions are thought to be malleable, and they could be elicited and subdued through conscious effort, through imposing that rational soul on the animal soul. So yes,
That's great.
Thank you so much. We have perhaps one more question if anyone wants to, or we can carry on over a glass of wine. And, thank you again. Thank you very much indeed. That was fantastic. It's been a brilliant day. I hope everyone's found it as stimulating and as enjoyable as I have. Please do help yourselves to a glass of wine. We are going to go for dinner at the Trediver. Unfortunately, we can only buy dinner for speakers, but anyone else is welcome to come along and join us. We're booked for about 7, but it might have grown a bit late, and that's just down room. So, are there any other housekeeping things or announcements or? No, okay, well, we will be emailing with those notes that I mentioned earlier, and we will let you all know when the keynote talks are available on the website.
And can I just say a massive thank you to you two, to Lisa and to Catherine for